Griffith is widely regarded to be one of the top 2 villains in all of anime, and for many people he easily takes the #1 slot without question. I believe that is for 3 main reasons that we will be exploring and breaking down. Before we get into that, I'm going to need a favor from you. This video isn't about whether or not Griffith deserves to be hated. Anyone with a reasonable media literacy should be able to agree with that one. However, before we continue forward, I'm going to need everyone to set aside previous feelings about him in order for the analysis to work. Once again, Griffith is who I believe to be the most vile villain myself, but through diving into his character in preparation for this video and in the past for research on my own, I was able to learn more than if I just entered with a Griffith is evil perspective. With that out of the way, let's get into the video. Many authors often play into this idea of perspective in order to make their villains more nuanced or in order to drive home other points of the story. Eren, for example, has an expressly evil goal, but it can be justified or condemned depending on the perspective of the viewer. Conversely, there are also villains within media that take away that option for the viewer entirely, presenting a character in a specific light. This is the case with Griffith, where the story pretty much tells us in every way possible that this is the bad guy, at least from the eclipse onward. This is the first reason that I believe Griffith is easily perceived as the most wicked villain in all of AniManga. The story simply tells us that interpretation of the character is correct. On the flip side, let's contrast him with another major pop culture villain painted in a different light, specifically the MCU's version of Thanos. Thanos is, of course, evil as most villains are, but not exactly in the same way that Griffith is. He's got his moments of arrogance, but the story frames him in far more of a different light than just a brutal tyrant dead set on killing. In his mind, he is protecting people, just going about it in an unsavory way. But for the vast majority of people, Thanos does not elicit the same type of disgust or emotion that Griffith does. In fact, people generally tend to have a bit more of emotional empathy for Thanos and his backstory. He lost everything because no one was able to sacrifice what needed to be sacrificed. Compare this to Griffith's torture before his transformation into Femto and the Eclipse. Griffith had amassed an army and secured a path to a kingdom using his charisma, beauty, voice, and ambition. But over the course of his year-long torture, his legs had been damaged, the beauty splayed off his likeness, and his tongue removed from his mouth. Griffith was broken and lost everything that made his ambition possible, taking away quite literally all that he was. His men nor Casca look at him with honor and respect anymore, but with pity and horror. For a man who has chased his dreams to lose all that he's ever lived for, Griffith is experiencing a fate worse than death. These two sets of circumstances up until their turning point into villainy are completely different. While the gut reaction might be able to say that he deserves it because he's Griffith, note that this all takes place before the events of the eclipse. However, when we talk about Griffith, this is never what we think of. On the flip side, Thanos is given a flashback with Gamora and him actively splitting and killing half of the entire planet. Once again, this also isn't talked about when discussing Thanos. Most of the time, the focus is on his willingness to sacrifice and the ideas that he represents. Why? Because of how the story frames both the characters respectively around the crux of their character. Thanos throws his daughter off the cliff with tears in his eyes. Griffith commences the eclipse with evil at the forefront. The story paints them and their particular types of evil in far different lights. The second reason I believe we react viscerally to Griffith as opposed to Thanos is the nature of the crime itself. See, whereas Thanos' sins are seen vaguely through flashbacks or spoken of, we don't actually get to experience them. Furthermore, the nature of the crime on display for us in Berserk as compared to what we see in the MCU elicits different effects. There may or may not be an official term for this, but in my own writing and analysis, I refer to evil acts as internal or external crimes. Even though Thanos has killed marginally more people in Infinity War, especially after he snaps his fingers, those deaths are seen as less heinous acts, but more peaceful dispersions of life. Thanos' kill count is a disgustingly high number after wiping out all half of life, however we don't feel this impact as powerfully as we do for the crimes that Griffith commits. His violation of Casca during the eclipse is what I classify as an internal crime, referring to a direct breach of intimacy. Whether physical, emotional, or mental, villains who breach this internal layer of intimacy are usually more likely to cause an intense physical or emotional reaction in the viewer. While Thanos simply kills external to the body, Griffith harms within the very soul. This is why mature stories such as Berserk or even horror films and books tend to use concepts like nudity and body horror so willingly. There is a natural recoil and disgust to these ideas we hold so sacred and intimate being desecrated. This is actually a major talking point in the book The Moral Psychology of Disgust, edited by Nina Strominger and Victor Kumar. Quote, disgust toward the acts measured with linguistic terms, disgusted, repulsed, sickened, grossed out, and anger was measured with angry, infuriated, outraged. They found that feelings of anger increased with the level of harm caused in the belief that someone's rights were being violated. End quote. Later on it reads, indeed, using a mediational approach, they found that across 4 studies that feelings of anger were largely aimed at the transgressor when consent was absent and were mediated by appraisals of injustice. By contrast, feelings of disgust were aimed more around the consenter when it was present that the consenter desired to engage in a non-moral act. As you can see, many times in horror media, or at least a type of media with the intent that makes us feel deeply enraged or unsettled, they would utilize these types of ideas and situations to create their intended effect. Also, there is a large portion of horror films and whatnot that specifically use nudity as a way to get butts in seats, but I believe that is an improper application of this idea. Anyway, conceptually, someone dying by disintegrating into dust and the human being we've grown to love being violated is a completely different thing. It also adds to the perception that the story frames each respective character in. Not only does the narrative let us know that Griffith is meant to be evil and hated, it supports that, and quite frankly creates this idea with the eclipse. The demonic imagery, the eclipse itself, and Griffith's appearance all play into that. Meanwhile, the non-violent nature of the snap, Thanos' fatherhood, and his empathy frame him in a far different way. If we are looking at pure statistics, Thanos has killed more, and so on a certain number-based axis, Thanos is far more evil by crime. However, none of us actually feel that way. Also, I don't mean to claim that Thanos is more evil than Griffith simply because he's killed more people. I feel as though that is a faulty take. If the stakes were elevated, I believe Griffith would have done the exact same and far worse if the object between him and his kingdom was on the same scale as it was for Thanos. However, the point still stands that the nature of their respective crimes is a major contributor as to why we hold them in the esteem that we do. The third and final reason I think we view these characters in such different lights is also in regard to how the story handles the fallout of both events. The 5-year time skip portrays the Avengers and society at large at least somewhat attempting to move on through Stark's having a family and Cap leading a recovery group. Of course, the majority of the Avengers have not moved on at all, but a lot of people have, or are at least trying to. Those 5 years also act as a buffer for the audience. We don't actually get to see the immediate aftermath of Thanos. We only hear about it and see where we're at 5 years from then. On the flip side, Berserk does not let the reader forget everything that Griffith has done and is doing as Femto and on behalf of the God Hand. Casca's mind being broken, Guts' relentless struggle against demonic entities, and their child's corruption are all constantly there to remind us why everything is happening. Regardless of where Guts is or what's at stake, it's all Griffith's fault. And we as the audience are exposed to this again and again and again and again until all we can think about is finally killing Griffith and earning back justice. I believe this reason of witnessing the aftermath and the previous reason of internal versus external crime also both rely on the psychological concept known as the identifiable victim effect. I wouldn't be surprised if you heard the quote that goes, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." Both that quote and the identifiable victim effect echoes the same ideas. If you hear the story about a single orphan child named Guts, desperate for food and water, naked, cold, alone, and weeping on the ground, you are more likely to feel an emotional response. But if I say millions of children die from hunger, you will still feel emotions, but not nearly as intensely as if you knew the story and the person affected by name. I believe this is the concept that is used to great effect in both the events of the eclipse and among the aftermath. While the eclipse is transpiring, our brains almost do a quick, horrifying risk assessment and ask us terrible words. What if? What if it was me or someone I knew in that situation? What if I was useless to help, or even worse, useless to resist? And by having both Casca and Guts in this scene, Kentaro provides almost everyone with an anchor. The women I've spoke to are more likely to feel disgusted by what Griffith did, whereas the men are just as likely to feel horrified and enraged as Guts was forced to bear witness to the event. It's easier for our minds to make this connection because we've seen Guts and Casca fall in love with each other and care for each other, helping one another overcome their past trauma and worries. And we spent so much time with them that we feel far more emotionally connected to the both of them which further increases our hatred of Griffith, since we've also seen him for the whole time. We saw his rise, fall, and loss of humanity all at once, and so everything is far, far more potent, almost as though you're being betrayed, harmed, and abused all at the same time. I believe it's for those three reasons: the perception the story guides us toward, the nature of the crime, and the personal connection of the aftermath that specifically makes Griffith so vile and widely known as the most wicked villain in all of AniManga. Since things here can get terribly and horribly dark, we've tried to approach this from a more analytical viewpoint to see what we can learn from the concepts at play. I hope you enjoyed this analysis of one of the most evil characters I've ever seen, and if you want to see more videos, go ahead and click the video on the screen or subscribe for new uploads. Until next time, keep dreaming.